Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon session. So today we have a presentation by Xavier Weinthal, who is working at CEA Grenoble, and he will tell us about his recent work on innovative approach to calculate diagrammatic perturbation theory numerically to large orders. So please, Xavier.
Okay, thank you, Denis. Hi, everyone. So yes, indeed, so we are going to discuss how to calculate Feynman diagrams. I mean, essentially to teach a computer to calculate Feynman diagrams. It's a field that was known as a diagrammatic quantum Monte Carlo. Maybe Michel Ferrero hinted a little bit about it. I don't know if in his lecture. Here, I want to discuss a path to calculate these Feynman diagrams, which is suitable for doing quantum transport. So I'm a quantum nanoelectronic guy. Essentially, I want to look at devices like a quantum dot or quantum point contact. I mean, the kind of device that we study in quantum nanoelectronics. And we have been studied for a long time, and we have been studied mostly without interaction. So these are systems which are already non-trivial without interaction. And the aim of this project was actually to try and bring electron-electron correlations into the scope of this project. So it's a work that we started something like 8 years ago. And the most salient things I will discuss today has been done by Corentin Bertrand and Marianne Masek, so the two PhD students, and Philippe Dumitrescu, which is a postdoc in New York with Olivier Parcollet. And Olivier Parcollet is my long-term collaborator on this. Bill Triggs is also a colleague. He's a machine learning guy, so that helped us with the recent development. And Serge Florent, you already have met, helped us with the benchmark for the impurity, understand impurity. So just a little bit of advertisement of what we do in my group before I move to the main topic. So we do software, open source software that you can use to solve your problem. And one of the software we have is called Quant, and you can essentially solve with it quantum transport problems, so essentially quadratic Hamiltonian like this. But when the system is infinite, so you have electrodes, and so the system is actually infinite, and you can solve these kind of things. And then we have been moving to time-dependent problems, essentially the same one, but now the Hamiltonian is time-dependent, and this is called Tquant. It's something that we have released recently. It's only available software. So open source software has been available since last September. And today I want to discuss the next stage of the rocket, which is how to introduce electron-electron interaction. Let's say so a term like this. In perturbation theory, so I'm going to discuss perturbation theory in power of U, to introduce correlations. And there are many cases where correlations are important for quantum nanoelectronics. In quantum dots, you can get Kondo physics. That will be something I will discuss today. And also Coulomb blockade. Coulomb blockade, I think, is very interesting because it's a problem we understand very well. We understand the physics very well. We have a complete theory of Coulomb blockade. Yet, and I find that extremely frustrating, I have no way to introduce simply Coulomb blockade in the kind of simulation that we do within Quant or Tquant. I just don't know how to do that. And so for me, it's the simplest problem, which actually is beyond mean field. It's a correlated problem. Okay, the correlations are very simple, yet it's a correlated problem. And there are a number of other physical problems in quantum electronics where we need correlations. For instance, one is called the 0.7 anomaly that is observed in a quantum point contact. Also in a quantum Hall effect devices, a fractional quantum Hall effect is, of course, something which is strongly correlated problem. And I would say the most recent and most, where there is a lot of discussions today, are quantum computers. And quantum computers, essentially a quantum computer is a many-body problem, out of equilibrium many-body problem. So it's totally in the scope of the things I want to discuss today, at least a few qubits, perhaps with their environment and these kind of things. So we need techniques to deal with this problem. Okay, this is just a few pictures to show what Quant can do. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but it's been used for, you see, graphene. This is you can put some superconductors. You can this is a topological insulator. You can use it for Majoranas, all kind of things. And so we work a lot to do things that are very generic. So if the problem is generic and we can explain it in a generic way, we try to teach a computer to do it as generic as we understand it. And we have the same gallery for T-Quant, and I don't want to spend too much time there either. And we go directly to the subject of today. So again, we have a non-interacting problem. Could be anything. Typically, it's a central region where we will put the interaction connected to leads. And the leads are typically infinite systems that are substantially invariant. And this is a quadratic problem, so H naught. And then we put some interaction in this central part. And we want to expand, calculate a quantity, for instance, the charge on the site, or a current, or something like that, or green function, in power of u, and calculate the expansion in power of u here, so we can get as many of these coefficients as we can. So this is traditionally done with Feynman diagram. So Feynman diagram essentially, so essentially each Qn here is a sum of many Feynman diagrams, factorial n Feynman diagrams in theory. And each of them is multidimensional integrals that we need to calculate. So the bare problem is just calculating a bunch of multidimensional integrals. So that's the outline. Actually, I forgot to, I added an introduction before, so there is an introduction on the physics of Coulomb blockade on Kondo physics. But then when we get to the interaction problem, so essentially we have three sub-problems. So we want to do, calculate all these Feynman diagrams. On the first problem that we will face is that there are a large number, factorial large number of diagrams. And so I will tell you how we dealt with that to reduce essentially this factorial n number of diagrams to 2 to the power n. So it's still exponential number of terms, but 2 to the n is actually not that big. 2 to the 10 is 1000. So we can actually go to fairly large orders. So the best we can do at the moment is 22 orders in the best cases. On 10 is really something we do routine. Okay, once we have dealt with the problem of the large number of diagrams, we need to calculate essentially n-dimensional integrals. And I will tell you how we do that and how we move from Monte Carlo to machine learning inspired techniques to do these integrals. And it's something which is a lot work in progress. I mean, we are making progress every month. And then, okay, suppose that you have calculated 10, let's say, or 15 of these orders. The last question that you have to answer is how do you reconstruct the left-hand side from the knowledge of a few 10, 15 coefficients on the right-hand side of this reconstruction. And I will tell you how we deal with that. Feel free to stop me at any time if I do something, if I say something unclear or you want more explanation of something, you can just stop it. So the technique is, in principle, is very general, but in practice, I will show you only a result for the Anderson impurity, so out of equilibrium Anderson impurity. So essentially, we want to describe a system like this. So you have a small pocket of electrons here, and that you confine with these gates. So these gates, you can put voltage on them, so you can deplete the electron gas underneath. So you can pretty much control the number of electrons that you have in this box. And you can, you have a reservoir of electron here. You can tunnel into this box and then tunnel out to another electron. So essentially, this problem maps onto one site, single site with interaction U connected to two 1D electrons in this simplest form. So the non-interacting problem is essentially this 1D problem with. So the hopping here is one everywhere except towards the central island where it's smaller. Here you have epsilon d actually correspond to a gate that allows you to control the number of electrons that you have inside your quantum dot. End up and end on are just a number of electrons up and down. And then you have the interaction on the dot u, which is just essentially the product end up and down. This 1/2 is not very important for the today's discussion. And there is this theta of t here, because essentially the way we do the calculation is that at t equals 0, we are in a non-interacting problem. And then we switch on interaction, and we wait until the system has relaxed to the interacting problem. So that's why you have this theta of t. So yeah, I'd like to discuss briefly the physics of this of the impurity, of the Anderson impurity. There is one, so the simplest thing that you can do is to look at when the impurity is almost disconnected from the reservoir. When it's almost disconnected, this is where you have phenomena of Coulomb blockade. So if you just calculate the number of the energy as a function of the number of electrons inside the dot, essentially you find that it's essentially m squared times u plus the term linear in n. And so if you want to add another electron to the system, actually it's going to require a finite amount of energy. You just calculate En plus 1 minus En. And so essentially, this is what we call Coulomb blockade, because it costs energy to put more electron. So if you have a very small bias voltage between your left electron and your right electron, you don't have enough energy to enter, and then you just see zero current. And if you put enough voltage, then eventually you will get above the threshold to get another electron inside the dot, and then you can actually see some current. Or you can do that, or you can play with the gate voltage epsilon d and make sure that the energy for n on n plus 1 electron is the same, and then you are at a point where you can actually get a new electron. And you get a nice picture like this called Coulomb diamond. This actually is experimental data, and there are tons of data like this in the literature. I took the one from Max O'Fines because he's a friend, and they are very beautiful samples. In this case, these are essentially, this sample is essentially a MOV set you could find in your computer. It's a very small silicon nanowire with gates and everything. At the end, it behaves as a quantum dot. And you see here, these points are the degeneracy points where n and n plus 1 electrons have the same energy. So this is where you can get current, and in between you have zero current, unless you put a large voltage so that you can actually bring be above the threshold. So this is a Coulomb diamond, and it's very important feature that is seen everywhere. And for instance, all these semi-conducting quantum computers, quantum bits, are based on the fact that we're going to trap one electron, for instance, or two electrons inside one of these quantum dots, and then use its spin as a qubit, for instance. And this is the conductance of this device as a function of the gate voltage. You see at 300 Kelvin, you find a very nice transistor. Here you close the transistor and you lose like many orders of magnitude in the conductance. And when you cool down the same thing, you start to see these very nice oscillations that correspond to Coulomb blockade. That correspond to a cut here in this direction. So that's Coulomb blockade. And it's correlated physics in the sense that you need to know the number of electrons that are inside your system to know whether you can get another one or not. So in that sense, it's beyond mean field. But it's very, very simple physics nevertheless. It gets more interesting where, so you consider Kondo. So Kondo is really the first non-trivial many-body problem that has been studied. So you consider now the repulsive interaction is strong, but not so strong. So you consider an electron in the reservoir, or maybe you should, yeah. So it can actually tunnel inside the quantum dot, and then another electron can tunnel out. And so of course, when you go inside the quantum dot, then it raises the energy of the charging energy. This is U. So if you calculate that in second order, sorry, with respect to the tunneling coupling here, you get a small gain in energy of order gamma square over U. That's just a second order perturbation theory. And what is very interesting is that this second order, this small gain of energy that you can get when U is not infinite, you can only gain it if you have an up electron, and then on here this is a down electron. Because if you have a down electron and here you have a down electron, then Pauli principle forbid you to gain this small amount of energy. So this small amount of energy you gain only when you are anti-parallel with respect to the spin of the electrons present in the quantum dot. That means that it's antiferrometric coupling. So you will get a magnetic coupling between the electron close to the quantum dot and the electron inside the quantum dot. But what is also interesting is that to get this antiferrometric coupling, you need the electron to be close by, right? You need the electron to be here. So it's if the electron is too far away, then you don't get any, you cannot gain any energy. So somehow this antiferrometric coupling, this magnetic coupling, is an attractive interaction. So it will actually attract electrons that they want to create a singlet, so to be with the spin of the electron inside the quantum dot. So I find it very nice because essentially you start from a repulsive interaction, and at the end of the day, effectively you get an effective attractive magnetic interaction. And this attractive interaction is going to bring density of state at the Fermi level, and that's the so-called Kondo resonance. So it's really the landmark of the Kondo effect. So that's my Kondo 101. So it's the most basic explanation I can give you for what is a Kondo effect. And now, if you look at, so again, there are tons of experiments showing Kondo effect, not as many as Coulomb blockade, but it's something that is seen very often. So now you see here a Coulomb diamond. So this is one degeneracy point, this is another degeneracy point, and then another and another. So in the plot before, essentially you have zero current in between. Now you see that you have a very high current at small bias, then zero, and then very high. So you get high current when you get a spin. So when you get a odd number of electrons, because you get a spin here, and then you can get the Coulomb, the Kondo resonance. And when you get an even number of electrons, then you have no spin to form this singlet, so you get no interaction, so you get no Kondo effect, and then Kondo effect again, and then here zero Kondo effect. And this is an experiment by a group of Takis Kontos. So, but there are many others, but I think these results are pretty nice. Okay, so that's it for giving you some context for this quantum dot. And I just flash you briefly some teaser of the kind of results we got with the new technique I'm going to discuss now, so that you will stay until the end of the talk, essentially. So this is a result, for instance. So this is the result of a single run of the algorithm that I'm going to discuss later. So it's a spectral density. So essentially the density of state on the dot as a function of frequency and interaction. So something which is very nice with this technique is that we get this full map in just one run of the code. So without interaction at u equals 0, you see that you have a resonance here. That corresponds to essentially the resonance for the single electron state. It's slightly off tune with the Fermi level of the reservoirs. Here you see there is a small, detune it a little bit. And when you switch on the resonance, you essentially, this resonance gets much thinner, and it gets actually also pinned at the Fermi level. And this is actually the Kondo resonance. You form this Kondo cloud that try to screen the spin of the electron. And you see also some side bands here, so-called Hubbard bands, correspond to the excited states with 0 electron or 2 electrons that show up on this. Okay, so essentially that's okay. That's an equilibrium result that you could get with other techniques than the one we have developed, but it's actually not so easy. And this is something that you get at equilibrium, sorry, out of equilibrium. So now I put some bias voltage across my quantum dot. On the bias voltage, it does two things. Essentially, it works a bit like a temperature, so it tries to destroy the Kondo effect to make it broader. On the other hand, you have now two Fermi level, one for the right and one for the left electrodes. And the system is trying to make two Kondo resonance until you get, essentially you split your Kondo resonance. So you split the Kondo resonance and you kill it at the same time, and it was not very clear which of the two effects would actually win first. And this is the first calculation where we could actually solve this problem I would say exactly, which means numerically with a given precision that we control without any uncontrolled approximation. And so this is the best result we have obtained so far with this new technique I'm going to describe now. So it's a strong motivation for us because it tells us that, okay, there are at least some problems, some tough problems that people have been trying to solve for a long time that could not be solved, or that we can now solve with this technique. And we hope that there will be many more of problems like that. Okay, so now let me stop the introduction and start for real. With the first problem, we need to calculate a large number of diagrams. And in this plot here, actually, this is just a bare output of the technique. Essentially, it calculates, in this case, the self-energy as a function of frequency at order 2, at order 4, at order 6. So this particular case when there are no odd orders, 8 and 10. You see, it's becoming very small. See, the orders is 10 minus 2, but it's 4, minus 5, minus 7. Here I can see because it's hidden by but okay, it's even smaller. Okay, this is Monte Carlo sampling, so you have an error bar attached to it. But nevertheless, we can calculate up to fairly large orders and with error bars that are reasonable and small enough that we can actually do a lot with these calculations. So everything that we do is done within the Keldysh formalism. And Keldysh is a formalism, usually it scares people. So let me explain it to you, at least the way I understand it in 4 lines, because it's actually very simple, I think. And it's much simpler than it looks like. It can be complicated to do calculation with Keldysh, in the sense that it can be a bit cumbersome. But from just a purely conceptual point of view, it's actually much simpler than the other approaches of to Feynman diagrams. So essentially, we start at t equals 0 from a non-interacting problem here. Then we switch on interaction. Okay. Then we measure something, and then we switch off interaction to go back to the non-interacting problem. Then we can take the trace with whatever initial density of state we had. And you see, this is different from what you do when, for instance, when you learn diagrammatic theory at 0 temperature. Usually you start from minus infinity, you go to 0, you measure, and then you go to plus infinity. And then you have to argue that you pick up a phase, so you divide by something to compensate for this phase. And this phase, when you expand, is going to give you the disconnected Feynman diagrams and blah, blah, blah. It's a long story. Here, it's much simpler. You switch on, measure, switch off. So there is no denominator whatsoever. Everything is very simple. But you have to pay a small cost for the simplicity. So now when you're going to expand, so now U of t is essentially my interaction. We work in the interacting implantation. And I want to expand in power of the interacting Hamiltonian of U. And now when I'm going to expand the exponential here, I have terms coming before O, before the time when I measure, and terms coming after that. And this end up with to what we call the Keldysh contour. So you see very often this picture where you have this contour. Yeah, it looks like it's a contour on the complex plane, like you are as if there were like some poles here on the time, real time. But no, what it really means is that we have, when we expand, we have times here that happen before we measure or after we measure. So each time here, U comes with another index, A, that is either 0 or 1, depending on whether it comes from the expansion of the before or after the interaction. So it's very simple. Really, Keldysh is very simple. The price for the simplicity is that you have this additional index, so-called Keldysh index, depending on whether you expand the H int come from before or after the observable. So you have to keep track of that. And so you want to calculate O, so you're going to expand. And after you have done this expansion, you essentially get a product of bunch of operators, and you need to average that. And this is this you know very well. You have weak determinant. I mean, sorry, you have weak theorem. So an average like that is essentially the sum over all permutation of C dagger 1 C P of 1, C dagger 2 P C P of 2, and so on and so forth. and you sum over all permutation, which means you sum over all pairing. And the next step that you usually do is that for each of these terms, you associate a Feynman diagram, and then you can start to look at them, try to find which are the important Feynman diagrams, and you can play with them for your entire lifetime. But if you have a numerical mind, when you look at this formula, you find that it's actually this sum of over permutation of -1 to the power of the signature of the permutation like this is really the definition of a determinant. It's a determinant of this matrix, C dagger I, Cj. Just look at it straight in the eye for five seconds. You find this is actually the definition of the determinant. And so it's much more favorable for our point of view if you are a numerical guy, because the determinant you can calculate very quickly and you don't have to sum over factorial n term. Instead, you can calculate in n to the cube term, or even less actually. And so this is exactly what we are going to do. But there is a downside. If you do that, okay, yeah, let me show you this formula first. So at the end of the day, and I show this formula because it's very, very ugly, but it's also extremely simple. On the left-hand side, you have what we are looking for, essentially interacting grain function. This is what we want. Essentially, all the observables, everything is coded in there. On the right-hand side, you have the sum over all orders, u to the power n. And then you have this, for each order, you have a multidimensional integral of order n, and the sum over all Keldysh indices. And then you have the interaction matrix elements, and this big determinant of non-interacting grain functions. And the good thing is that essentially, we know everything there is on the right-hand side. This non-interacting green function is a non-interacting green function. We know how to calculate that, especially in my group, because we have spent a lot of energy setting up all this software to calculate all the propagators that you can dream of from non-interacting problems. So we know how to calculate these guys. So determinant, we know how to calculate. And then we are just left with the problem of calculating these multidimensional integrals. At this stage, I want to say one word about the fact that this sum over Keldysh automatically cancels the disconnected diagrams. And that's so what we are going to do is we are going to invert the integral on the sum, and we are going to do the sum explicitly. And this way, we get rid of all the disconnected diagrams. And for a given set of times here, u1, un, all the disconnected diagrams are automatically cancelled. So that's our trick. That's how we essentially get a nice integrand that behaves nicely, which means that when 2 times are getting away from the time when we measure, the integrand is going to decrease very nicely because there are no disconnected diagrams that could be in the way. On this, we can actually look, if you look at the integrand for order 2, so very simple case. So for given Keldysh indices, so here you have 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, and 1, 1. You see that the integrand actually goes all the way. So you measure here, and there here we only went to 10, 10 in time, and you see there is an integrand everywhere. And actually, this almost cancels with this. Blue is positive, red is negative. And when we do the sum over these 4 quadrants, we get the right-hand side here. And now you see that now you have a nice integrand that decays very quickly. And that this you have a chance to be able to integrate. So this is what we do, and this is how we essentially trade the initial factorial n problem to get a problem that we can solve in 2 to 12. Feel free to stop me. Huh? Okay, I don't seem to be able to move. Okay. Okay, I will just say very quickly, but for people that are a bit more know a bit more about these things. This is again the matrix that we are calculating the determinant. And if you look at it in the eye, you find that there is only one row, the last one, where all the t dependence is. So if we expand along this row, we can get essentially the full t dependence in terms of n minors, small n minors. And that's how we do actually to get the full frequency dependence. Initially, I showed you some plot where you get a full frequency dependent in one run, and we use this expansion, this kind of expansion to do this kind of stuff. So that's not very important for this talk. And that's again the bare data actually. So bare data here are shown in frequency, but the truth is we calculate everything in time and we only do Fourier transform to get the frequency. Okay, so now we have discussed the first problem.
Xavier, sorry,
yes,
may I interrupt? Can you please tell what is the matrix sizes that you are computing? Is it 10 by 10 or 1000 by 1000?
They are order n. So if we want to do a calculation at order 10, essentially, so okay, in the general case, if you want to calculate to order 10, n, it's 2n plus 1 times 2n plus 1. So these are small matrices, typically 21 by 21 for if you want to get all Feynman diagrams up to order 10. In practice, it's often simplified a bit because they have some block structure. So usually in the cases, for instance, of this Anderson model, if you want to calculate order 10, it's a 10 by 10 matrix. So you have at order 10, you have 2 to the power 10, so that's 1,000 matrices 10 by 10 that you want to calculate the determinant of on some. Okay, so very small matrices, very different from you're not in the thousands by thousand or this kind of techniques. Okay, so now so essentially we have this integrand here. It's a sum over determinant, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. We want to do a multidimensional integral over let's say 10 variables. And we want to calculate f1, f2, f3, f4 until we can't anymore. So there are. It's actually, so if you look at how to calculate multidimensional integrals, so for 1D, okay, 1D, we have tons of techniques. And they converge very fast. In 1D, you get essentially, you can get exponential convergence. Most techniques that work even for relatively ugly integrand, you can 1 over 2n to the power something large. So 1D, you can get a lot of digits on calculating your integral very, very well. But 2D, it's okay, you can do it, but you start to, 1D is without suffering, 2D you suffer a little bit. On 3D, 4D, you need a very big computer, and it's going to be very challenging to get 4D integrals. And so, so very quickly, at 4D or sometimes even 3D, people switch from the quadrature method that we use for at small dimension to Monte Carlo method. And so this is called the dimensional curse. I'm going to try to explain what is the dimensional curse. And I'm not going to explain how it's done with Metropolis, with Monte Carlo, because I suspect that you have already had some exposure to these kind of things. So let me first explain a bit what is a dimensional curse. So you want to do an integral in 1D, but suppose a function is essentially 0, and it's non-zero. Let's say you want to integrate between 0 and 1, but your function essentially is non-zero between 0 and a small epsilon. So if you do in 1D, okay, you get only, let's say epsilon is, let's say 10%. 10% of the, so you want to calculate your integrand actually is non-zero, only 10% of this. In 1D, you don't really care. You throw 1,000 points, okay, 90% of them give you nothing, but the 10% that remains are enough that you get a nice precision of your integral. In 2D, it's 10% square. So only 1% of your point will actually count for calculation of the integral. And in 3D, it's 0, 1 to the power 3. So now it's one point every 1,000 will work. And in 10 dimension, you find that if you calculate 10 billion points, only 1 will actually be non-zero. So, and this is called the dimensional curse, which means that if your integrand has a support which is small, with respect to it's not non-zero everywhere, then your integral, I mean, essentially the volume, the corresponding volume or hypervolume, decrease exponentially with the number of dimensions. And you don't want that. You don't want to throw points and calculate zeros, zeros, zeros after zeros. What you want to do is to compute your integrand where it's non-zero. So the standard approach for this is a Markov chain Monte Carlo. So Monte Carlo, the most well-known algorithm is Metropolis. And it works very well. It works very well. It's very versatile, and essentially we love it. But essentially it has very slow convergence. So essentially we have 1 over square root of n convergence which means that if we want we have some result with 1 digit, we want a second digit, we have to multiply the computing time by 100. And that's not very good. And Metropolis also is really made for large dimension integrals, where really that's the only method that can work. But here we are not going to do calculation in very large dimension. We are interested in calculating at order 10. And 10 is not so large. And so so essentially the new kind of technique that we are building now, we are trying to see whether we cannot do something in between Monte Carlo and quadrature, what we do in 1D, that is more adapted to this to the kind of dimension that we are looking. Also, something important is that this integrand here, f, so in typical Monte Carlo run, you call this integrand millions of times, tens millions of times, sometimes even billions of times. And but each time you call it, you just pretend you know nothing about the integrand. Right? So one of the ideas also that we are trying to push is that when you call your integrand, you learn about it, and maybe you can actually use this knowledge for future, for instance, for sampling the better your integral, or to do something about it. And that's one of the ideas, actually the key idea that has been pushing us for this new kind of approach that we are designing now. So I'm going to present some, it's really preliminary result. I mean, we have essentially one paper on this. We used to do everything with Monte Carlo, and I will show you some data later that have been obtained with Monte Carlo sampling. But now we are trying to get away from Monte Carlo entirely. And so the idea now is to machine learn the integrand, essentially. So we have, this is the integrand. Okay, we can compute it. It's a bit costly because each call to this function called cost 2 to the power 10 determinant 10 by 10. So, okay, you need to do some calculation. And the idea is to build an approximate of this function I call P. We call it a Warper function. And that is as good as approximate as we can get. And then we can use this approximate to sample the integral in much better way. And so the idea is that we will essentially we will sample directly P. So we make sure that Pn is a nice function enough that we know enough about it that we can actually calculate all kinds of cumulative functions, partial cumulative functions. So we can sample this guy. And then we can build a change of variable. So where we sample this guy, so now everything is flat with respect to P. So you essentially write U, this U here is a function of X, new variable, so that the Jacobian is 1 over P. So that after the change of variable, you want to calculate essentially now integral over X of F times the Jacobian. And if the Jacobian is 1 over P, you get F over P. And if P is a very good approximation of F, then you are calculating an integral which is now almost flat, almost constant. So that's the idea. I'm going to show you some results which are a bit old already. We are much better results now, but okay, it's beyond what I could do in 1 hour and 30 minutes. With a very simple warping function. So this is the integrand we take just as a product of 1D function that depends on the difference between consecutive views. So we found that this is actually not bad. You can see that it's very far from the real integrand, but you can try to fit this function to the integrand. And when you do, you go from, so this is again in 2D, this is the integrand that we want to calculate in 2D, in scale. And after we use this warping, so now we essentially sample directly this, you get something which is almost flat. It's not exactly flat, but it's almost flat. And now we have a chance maybe to calculate this integral in a much better way. So the last ingredient is what we need to calculate this integral are so-called quasi-random numbers. So quasi-random numbers is a very bad word. It shouldn't be called like that. It has really nothing to do with random numbers. So once we have an integrand like this, very flat, now we don't need important sampling anymore. We don't need important sampling anymore. So now we could just throw points at random between this hypercube 0, 1 to the power n, and keep adding points until we get a nice convergence. And if we do that with standard Monte Carlo, so called pseudo-random numbers, so this is typically the kind of numbers that you get if you throw points randomly between 0 and 1 here, and 0 and 1 here, in 2D. You see you get places where you have many points and then places where you have nothing. And it makes sense because we are doing things at random, and so it's not uniform at all. And that's actually the origin of this 1 over square root of n convergence. It takes a lot of points to cover everything when you are throwing things at random, because most often than not, you are putting 2 points almost at the same point, and there is a big hole where you don't put any points. So these quasi-random numbers, they are not random at all. They are sequences that are made, that are constructed, so that you actually sample the hypercube in a way which is as homogeneous as possible. So there are many, there's a big theory on these numbers. Simplest one are called Sobol. Nice thing about Sobol numbers is that when you can always add new. So for instance, when you add a new number, it will try to fit it in essentially the biggest hole that you can find. There are also other rules, lattice rules, which are very simple to produce. They are a bit more complicated to use because you have to work at fixed number of samples, but essentially they are as homogeneous as possible. So if you wanted to produce these things, the best method would be to do some classical simulation of small balls that essentially try to get away to molecular dynamics. If you want to get away as much as possible from the neighbor, and you want to get something which is as homogeneous as possible. On using this kind of distribution, much more homogeneous than this, you will now have a chance to break the 1 over square root of n convergence rule. So this is the first result we got. So it's on a better on that. So it's a calculation where actually we know the exact answer for this one. So it's a very nice benchmark. So regular quantum Monte Carlo are the blue curves, so order 6 and 8. And this is really so it should converge to 1 at large n, and it does, but it takes a long time. And now when we use this warping function plus these quasi-random numbers, you see that we get a much better convergence. So this is a nice case, better than that case where everything converges very nicely, where we get a speed up which is huge, 2 million or more. But the nice thing is that it's very robust. So we didn't get always a speed up as good as that, but we always got a speed up at least 101,000, even in the worst situations. And more importantly, if you look at the error now, so error as a function of the number of points in the simulation, you find that now it decreases as 1 over n in this case, instead of the 1 over square root of n that we get with regular Monte Carlo. So I think this is all I wanted to say for the technique. It's really a work in progress. Now we are working with warping functions that are much more expressive. They are so expressive that we even have ops that we won't need to do the quasi Monte Carlo at the end. We will just take the integral of the warping function as the result. So this is a work in progress, but the overall idea is that we can, all the information, so essentially the overall idea that we are working at order n equals 6, 8, 10, 12, not so high. And for this intermediate multidimensional integrals, probably Monte Carlo is not the most efficient way to do. So the last thing, the last problem we have to solve, and after that I will be able to show you some data, is how to reconstruct the observable. And so here is a very simple example. Take the function 1 over 1 plus u. Okay, nice enough. So it's plotted here, 1 over 1 plus u. And suppose I give you a few 10 of the, so I make an expansion in power of u. So this is it. It's 1 minus u plus u squared minus u cubed, etc. And I give you the first 10 or 12 coefficients, and I ask you to reconstruct this function. So the most stupid thing that you could do is just to take a few terms, for instance, here 4 and 5, and you plot the polynomial. And you will find that for 5 it goes like that, and for maybe like this, and for 4 it goes like that. So essentially the beginning of the curve you have it nicely, but at some point they start to get away from each other. And if you add more terms, okay, you can continue a bit further, but eventually it diverges. It diverges because this series has a radius of convergence, and this radius of convergence is 1. So you cannot go beyond 1. You can put thousands of terms, it's going to diverge at 1 nevertheless. That's a bit annoying, especially since this function is very nice. Nothing happens here. Nothing happens at u equal 1. So this divergence is purely from the series. And why is it? It's because, well, yes, there is a problem at not at 1, but at -1, because you have a pole here at -1. And you know that the radius of convergence of the series, when we expand around 0, will be given by the first pole or branch cut or whatever non-analytic city we have on the sphere. So you are, because of a pole that you have here at -1, it prevents you from calculating here after +1, and that's annoying. So there are tons of ways to do this reconstruction. The way we push forward is to essentially look at it from an analytical continuation problem. So you have a real part of u, an imaginary part of u. So you consider u as a complex parameter. And we are going to make a conformal transformation to try to essentially push away this guy as far as we want, as we can. So this is a same thing, but now for something more interesting. So this is the Kondo temperature, so the width of the Kondo resonance as a function of u. And you see these correspond to different truncations, so where we kept, I don't know, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 orders. So we find that it diverges. So the radius of convergence is around 5 in this case. The black dot are the numerical randomization group data that Serge Florence calculated for us. The red correspond to what we were able to reconstruct with some widths correspond to the error bar, and the green correspond to the better-than-that that we found actually. We found out this better-than-that solution after we wrote the paper. It was actually one of the referees that pointed it to us. So it's really something that we found. It was very nice checks that we could do afterward to see whether it worked or not. Yeah, okay. And so now I'm going to explain how we do this reconstruction in practice. So the idea again is if you have a radius of convergence corresponding to this white region here, it means that you have a pole somewhere on the circle. For instance, in this case, it's here, and you may have branch cut or something like that. But we want to calculate here for a point u, which is outside of the radius of convergence. So we rely on what we call the separation property hypothesis. So we suppose that there is a region here. It's a supposition that we can check, but the idea is that we suppose that there is a region here. And inside this region, so this region contains the point where we want to calculate. It contains also the point where we do the expansion. And And inside the point, inside this region, there are no singularities or branch cut or anything. The function is nicely analytic. So we are going to do a change of variable, so change from u to variable w, where essentially we are going to map the inside of this red curve here towards the inside of the unit circle, on the outside of it towards the outside of the unit circle. And this way, well, essentially by construction, all the poles, all the singularities get outside of the unit circle. So now my new point here is inside my convergence radius, and I can calculate by just calculating the truncated slurry in power of W. And we can actually check that this series is convergent. And so if it is not, it means that the hypothesis was wrong, and we have to take a different curve C until we find one that does not contain any singularity. So that's the idea. We could also, something else we are also doing is we are trying to find out where are the poles. For instance, in this case, we calculated the series of 1 over tk. And so if you have a pole for tk, then it's a 0 for 1 over tk. And actually, you can look at the zeros of 1 over tk. You do calculate the expansion of 1 over tk, and you find that, okay, at order 6, you get the guys, at order 8, on order 10. And so some of these guys are essentially spurious zeros, and some of them actually do not vary with orders, and this corresponds to real zeros of tk, which are the poles. And so in this way, we are able to actually find out where are the poles of this. And so once we know where are the poles, or at least the closest poles, we have a better chance to build a conformal transformation that can work. And so we have typically this is the decay as a function of n of the series. So for instance, in this case, if the radius convergence is close to 1, it does not decay. It's bigger than 1, it decays. And if it's smaller than 1, then actually it increases exponentially. And then we can check after the fact, after we have done the conformal transformation, whether we have a better radius of convergence and whether the new function is convergent for the point we are interested in. And in this case, yes, we had the better answer that came once again after the calculation, and we actually we calculate exactly where are the poles, and they are where we found them with this approach. So there are tons of conformal transformation that one could build, and we have tried quite a few. The simplest one is the Euler. So it's essentially, it maps this line here. So it takes as a parameter this position P, so that this line is a mediatrice. It's perpendicular to this segment and goes through the middle. I'm not sure about the English name. So it maps essentially this towards the unit circle. So green goes to green, light green goes to light green, white to white, and red to red. So you see that if all the poles are on the left of this line, then you're very happy because you want to calculate here. And all this will be deep inside the convergence radius. Right, there will be no problem. We have also the parabola. So it maps this parabola to the unit circle. And again, now it's actually, if you have a pole here, it will be an issue for the Euler transform, but not for the parabola. And so on there are others, we are now black toolbox to construct any Schwarz-Christoffel transformation, so we can make something which is piecewise linear with any shape we want. Okay, on the last piece, okay, maybe I want to mention is that if your initial series is so there is some level of precision that we have in the calculation of the series, and what we do is that after we do the resummation, we resample. So we take many series compatible with our error bars. So we take random series, but within the error bars. And if the series that you have is not very good initially, you see when you do this transformation and you do this resummation, it works very well. You can even get after the convergence radius, but eventually the error that you have in your coefficient get amplified, and at the end you get nothing. In this case, we knew that the Kondo temperature at 0 temperature, at a large U is 0. And so we can do Bayesian inference, which means that we can post-select those of these curves that correspond to additional information that we want to put inside the system. And this way, we can reduce quite dramatically the errors that we have due to the imprecision in the initial calculation. So this is something also that we use whenever we can, and it can actually help tremendously to get much more precise with it. It's a way to systematically add information that you know about your observable that is not contained in the initial series expansion. Yeah, so this is again TK. As a function of parameter, I'm not going to explain what it is, but it says this parameter has to be small. And this was the initial calculation we had. So with a numerical renormation group with energy data from the Serge. And initially we were, happy in the sense that it gives the same thing, but you see there is a small error, and we could not really control this error. And we were a bit annoyed by that. And eventually the better on that, we got the better on that solution, and it turned out that the better on that solution was actually much closer to our data than the energy. So and then Serge was able to rework a bit on the energy and improve. But the bottom line is that even though energy is the technique of choice for the equilibrium Anderson model, in this kind of regime of interaction, U equal 9, which is already deep in the Kondo regime, we are actually more precise than energy is. And this is you see even so this is a new data. So you get the better on that. Our data on the energy, improved energy. So this is what best that Serge could do. And we are still, we have typically one more digits than energy could get, even though Serge actually made his computer suffer quite a bit for this calculation. So we can be very precise. Okay, and so I'm done with the 3 technical points I wanted to cover. And I think actually I am I've been very fast. So I will probably finish before the end of my 1 hour and 30 minutes. So feel free to stop me at any time. I probably need 15 more minutes to finish, but so we have plenty of time. So let me show you first some benchmarks. So this is a spectral density. So this is really at equilibrium. Spectral density versus frequency. So you see, you get this also U equals 0 dashed line, and then this is the interacting one at U equal 9. On the energy. So it's okay. So it works very well. We have a very nice agreement. Even if you zoom and you actually, so if you take the self energy, it's not really a zoom, but it's a self energy is much more sensitive to the spectral function. Actually, spectral function, you find out that for this particular case, which is a particular all symmetric, even a second order calculation is actually quite good. You cannot really distinguish here. But when you look at the self energy, you can see that the second order is actually not so good, and we get a very close agreement with the energy. And as close as we could get. There's still a small discrepancies here, for instance, and we are not sure, but we think it's more a problem of energies than of the diagrammatic calculations. On the right-hand side, you get the position of the poles as a function of frequency. So we can actually try to track these poles as a function of frequency, and then for each frequency, once we know where's the pole, we can take the correct conformal transformation. On the distance between this pole and the 0 should be the convergence radius of the series. And so we have 2 ways to calculate the convergence radius of the series. Either we look at this distance, that corresponds to this colored curve here, or we just look at how the coefficient decay with N. So that's the plane line. And you see we have a very nice agreement between the 2 techniques, which make us confident that we actually are capable of finding these poles, at least in this case. So there is a single pair of poles essentially per frequency. I mean, close to the real axis. Maybe they are more farther away, but we could not see them. and they were not annoying for calculation. We can also calculate, so this one was particular symmetric. This one is not particular symmetric. So the resonance is actually not at the Fermi level when we switch on interaction. And I find it quite nice, actually, the fact that even though it's perturbation theory in power of u, the result actually doesn't look at all like what you have non-interacting. Now you have shifted the peak. It's actually much thinner. You get these shoulders here correspond to the Hubbard bands. And so you have all kinds of features that you get, even though that were not at all in the non-interacting system. And I find that a pretty nice feature of this technique on this resummation thing, that you can really get non-perturbative results, even though we are just doing plain all the perturbation theory. This is the same thing, but now a color map view. So particular symmetric or not particular symmetric. So you have seen this plot before. Again, what is nice about this calculation is that since we have the series in U, we get the entire U dependence and also frequency dependence in one run. So you can really see how this feature gets formed, how the Hubbard bands get formed, and so on and so forth. And then so the last one I want to show is so out of equilibrium, we can also calculate. So this one I also mentioned before. Let me say a few words about the competition. So there are, a bit after us, there was one paper by essentially the group of Emmanuel Gould on Guy Cohen. They are taking an approach which is essentially opposite to us. So we are doing perturbation theory in power of U. They are doing perturbation theory in power of the hopping between the dot and the leads. So these are complementary approaches. And we could get, I think we have a better one at that, but we essentially would get a match. But I'd like to say that we are still, I mean, they could not get to the regime we were in terms of very low temperature and very high bandwidth. So we had to go to, but we, by raising the temperature a little on the, for instance, here is, yes, finite temperature, while this calculation has been at 0. We could get a match with them. Even I think we have a precise one in, not find the slides. And that technique is also very interesting. On the other hand, it cannot, it's really a technique that is made for impurity problems. While in principle, our technique should work, and we are hoping to demonstrate that soon for lattice problems like Hubbard models or these kind of things. Okay, and yeah, so once again, now so you get this is a Coulomb blockade. So if you now we can, so that's actually this previous calculation has been done with Monte Carlo sampling, but now with this new quasi Monte Carlo sampling, we can be much faster. So we could do sweeps, entire sweeps, for instance, over one gate like this. And you see, you can get the Kondo ridge, and you can get the Coulomb blockade, depending on the bias voltage, on what kind of interaction you have. And I probably have one last. Oh no, still. Okay.
Xavier, may
Yes?
I ask a question? What
Sure.
is the dashed line on the bottom picture?
Bottom, this one.
Yes.
It's a
The
non-interacting. It's a non-interacting result. So in this case, you see so at 0 temperature, the Kondo resonance goes to 1, and so also the dash line goes to 1. But here, because we have the bias voltage, you essentially don't get a perfect resonance, so it only goes up to 0.45 in this case. So we have zoomed the curve a little bit so that you can see the splitting of the Kondo peak. But you split it, but you also kill it, right? So it's the same as this. It's the same. The dash line is the same one as this one here. It's non-interacting. Okay. Well, I'm not going to dwell on that, but we can calculate the current, of course. We can calculate essentially pretty much any observable we want. So this is for particle symmetric. So at small bias, essentially you get perfect transmission. You get a slope which is 1. And then as you increase the bias, because of essentially you get hit by the Coulomb blockade, and so you current doesn't increase as fast. What is interesting is that if you start from something off resonance, now when you switch on interaction, you can really see that now you get your Kondo resonance, and then now you get back to the perfect transmission. So you see that your transmission at zero bias increases when you increase the repulsive interaction. That's one of the non-intuitive features of the Kondo effect. And I think this is my last slide before the conclusion. It's something that I find pretty neat, and we have not spent a lot of time thinking about the physics, but let me explain what it is. So at equilibrium, you can define, so as there is a theorem that the J lesser green function is essentially the imaginary part of the retarded one, so the spectral density, times the Fermi function. So you can define, now this is true for any problem out at equilibrium. So now for a non-equilibrium problem, you can define your effective Fermi function as the ratio of the two. Okay, so it should be at equilibrium. You can only find one thing, and this one thing is the Fermi function with the temperature of your problem. But out of equilibrium, without interaction, you find this double step at zero temperature. You have a double staircase. Essentially, you have it's a Fermi function, but split into two, one with a V bias between the two. So this is something that has been measured, for instance, these kind of things. For instance, Hugues Potier on Urbina, they had some experiments on nanowires like from 15 years back, trying to measure the out of equilibrium density distribution function. You can do that, for instance, with very small superconducting fingertips. So in principle, you can measure this quantity. And then while we switch on interaction, we could actually calculate this thing. And it's actually, what we find is a bit funny. Is you get something that wants to look like, you see this part here, want to look like some effective temperature. It looks like the beginning of Fermi function. But then you still have a jump here. You always have a finite jump, even at infinite interaction. And then here you have a linear part. There have been some old calculations of pure perturbation theory, so that's compatible with what we find. And honestly, I didn't find a nice physics interpretation for this yet. I mean, we didn't spend a lot of time thinking about it neither. But I find it pretty neat that we can start to calculate this kind of objects, and they can be quite different from what we would expect from an effective temperature, for instance, or something like that. Okay, I'm done. I've been much faster than I thought. Should have made a rehearsal. So this is my conclusion. So, I mean, overall idea is that we have made an approach which is very, very basic, very simple. I mean, conceptually, it's just, okay, let's write all the Feynman diagrams and just calculate them. Of course, there are some technical problems to actually do that in practice, but we are solving them one by one, and we are making more and more progress. So I think more and more problems now are open to this kind of techniques. So I don't know if you had something from Michel on the lattice on imaginary time version of Hermetic Monte Carlo, but it also progressed very, very fast. And I'm very confident that a lot of problems will be solved in the near future using these techniques. At the moment, we are really working on lattices, and we have preliminary results showing that it will work on lattices. It should. You could also use, since we have an impurity solver, you could use it as an impurity solver for DMFT. Also, we have also projects there. I have many problems in nanoelectronics I want to apply this to, like 0.7 anomaly, problem of a few qubits, for instance. You have one silicon qubit, one spin qubit, and now what happens if you get a little bit of Kondo effect that try to screen the spin and you try to do Rabi oscillation or this kind of experiment. What will happen in presence of Kondo resonance? We don't know. And we're also working to make this, this is something I'm very attached to, that everything we do should eventually end up as an open source software that, all the hard work is not lost, but actually be used by other people to make nice, nice project. And so, yeah, I will stop here. And thank you for your attention. And we have plenty of time for questions if you have any.
Okay, thank you, Xavier. So there is a question from Anton.
Yeah, hi Xavier, thank you once again for your presentation. Quite an impressive result you are presenting now. Well, I had some rather technical questions, it seems to me. Could you get back on the previous slide, please? Yeah, and could you please explain me what it means to have an infinite interaction within your method? Because it seems to me that it's kind of hard to formally reach the infinite interaction limit within your problem. I can only understand it as if you made a analytical continuation of your result obtained after this reconstruction of the whole series. Is
yes.
this what you're actually doing?
Yeah, so we use the technique I mentioned before, which means this, so we do a conformal transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And then we, for instance, in this case, there was only one pole on the negative real axis. So you can use Euler transform, and then you actually, this particular case, even u equal plus infinity maps towards w equal something. And if your series in power of w is convergent for this w equals something, then you can go all the way to u equal infinity. And we have checked that in several cases. For instance, for TK, I show you a curve for the Kondo temperature. Here, you see I can go all the way to infinity. For the charge on a dot, I can also go to all the way to go infinity. So of course, it is an ethical continuation, but it's a controlled one. So we do this conformal transformation. And then sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes we get a series that does not converge for the point we are interested in. That means that there are other singularities that we brought in, and they are in the middle of what we want to do. That's an issue. But at least it will not fail silently. It will always tell you, okay, now this result you can trust, this works. And then we know that we have the result all the way to up to u equal infinity. Sometimes it's less. Typically, it's yeah, so it depends a bit. We also work on the expansion itself. This is something I didn't explain, but sometimes you can actually change the non-interacting Hamiltonian and put counter terms in the interacting ones. And then you are making a different expansion, and then the radius of convergence may increase or decrease. And so by changing the expansion that you are doing, sometimes you can go to different value of larger value of
okay, yeah,
so all kind of tricks that we are playing.
Makes much sense, yeah. Okay, now connected to this, I would also like to ask, okay, as far as I understand, your technique allows you to find the singularities which are nearest to the point from like with respect to which you are expanding.
Yes.
Now, as you explained here, those might be some simple singularities such as poles, and in which case what you're actually doing is some kind of resummation which corresponds to your reconstruction. But apparently quite an unexpected question, I guess, is what if those singularities actually have a form of a cut? And this is the first question. And related to this is how, like a more general, a more broad question is how your method generally reacts to existence of let's say some phase transitions in the initial model. So could you please comment on that?
So we have tried several at least toy cases with branch cut and everything. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that you are able to find a region inside this C here where you have no poles, no singularity, no branch cut, no anything. So something where, so you need to find a region where, which is as big as possible. I mean, as far away from the 0, point and from the point you want to calculate as possible, that contain no singularity. So if you find, if you find it, I mean, let's say you take one, you can always construct a conformal transformation that will map this towards the unit circle on the other rest.
Yeah, this I understand, thanks.
Yes. So it's more about, it's not about finding where are the poles, it's about finding where a region without the poles. Now, in practice, we have built cases where there was like a branch cut like this, for instance, and we've been able to resum past it by taking a parabola like that. So in principle, it should work for complicated cases. In practice, it can be a real issue. And so we have not yet looked at cases where you have actually, but if you have a first order phase transition, for instance, here, it could be an issue totally. So it's, I mean, we'll see. It's something that we will discover as we make progress, whether we can bypass these problems or not. Maybe it's an issue for a given series, but maybe if you start from different starting points, you can actually get a series which is much better, which is something that we have witnessed in many cases. So okay, I can only, okay, it's a, so the nice thing about this technique is at least it doesn't fail silently. So if you, either it works, so while there are some techniques of resummation which are a bit like cookery, where with very shallow mathematical foundations, where you get an answer, but you will never know whether it's correct or not. Here we don't get this issue.
Okay, so let me just kind of reiterate what you were saying, and please correct me if I'm wrong. So regarding the first question about the cuts, as far as I understand, basically, when you are bounded to a finite order of your series, cuts, they present themselves as a very dense set of poles, as far as I can imagine. So this technically should be fine by your method, because like anyway, this is a detectable singularity. Yes. Now, so it doesn't matter at this point whether it's a pole or a cut. Now, regarding the second question, what you are saying is that your method is definitely gonna break down as is for any non-analyticity of the target function, but what we can do at this point is to apply some clever resummation technique. Let's say just use some counter terms in the non-interacting part of the problem, in order to accurately reflect the corresponding physics, and then hope that we've kind of removed this essential singularity, which forbids us from any kind of perturbative expansions, and then proceed as previously, right?
Yeah, that's one idea. But there are other ideas. So the way I see it, I think it's very important to disconnect the technique to do perturbation theory, essentially to calculate Feynman diagrams, and then what we do with it. And we could try to do some randomization group, for instance, once we have, we could try, there are many things we could try to do, how to use it. Yes, I mean, it's really the beginning of a story, and so we don't know yet what will be the most effective way of using it.
So this. Yeah, but basically the key achievement is the very ability to sum the large orders of the perturbation theory so effectively. Yeah.
Yeah. Get 15 to 20 orders of perturbation theory with 2-3 digits. That's essentially
the this is very impressive. This is very impressive. Thanks.
Next question from Artem.
Yes. So my question, thanks for the talk first. So my question was, maybe I did not understand it fully, but how do you recover the full time dependence? Kind of, do you need a single simulation or do you do multiple simulation? Maybe I did not quite get this part, because I mean, you need some
Yes,
some kind of time range, right, to get the frequency.
Yes, so, okay, there are several aspects. There are two times. Because essentially we want to calculate g of t prime. And so what we do for, there are two times, and we can actually in a single simulation we can get these two times. So you see the two times are here, t and t prime. So a priori, in the way I presented it like that, when you get this big function, t and t prime are fixed, and then we just calculate for t and t prime. And let's say you want t prime to be large, far away from t equals 0, where you switch on interaction. So typically, we can actually even work directly with t prime in the thermodynamic limit, so t prime equal infinity. And then we only work with t minus t prime. And so one way to do so, to get all the values of t as a single thing, here we expand this determinant along this last row. So it's essentially this coefficient time the determinant without this row and this column, plus this one times the determinant without this one on this column. And you find out that all these minors, when I cross here, for instance, they don't contain any t dependence. So what you do essentially, you bin these different minors, and you just remember to which U1 or U2 they correspond to. And so later you can get in one simulation the entire t dependence. And we can also get the entire t prime dependence if we want to. Typically, for instance, we can, when we calculate a point, we can just check whether it's inside the integration region we are interested in. If it's not, we just don't keep it. So we can, for instance, bin and get many different values of t prime in a single calculation. So we have some data I didn't show them, but we can compute everything as function of t and t prime single shot.
But I mean, then, so kind of, if you do the simulation, I mean, what is the output then? You cannot have infinitely many outputs for each t, right? So
yes,
in that sense, you can only, like what's the output? Do you get a function, a coefficient for a function?
No, we bin the t's. So we bin the t's, but we take 100,000 bins. So at the end of the day, it's as if it was continuous.
I see. So you get kind of an array out. Yeah.
An array, yes, we get an array of t's. Yeah, an array of the function for linear t's. This array is very noisy, but when we Fourier transform, because it's very noisy, it's not really noise. It's because sometimes we have even more bins than points. So that means that there are very few values. But then when we Fourier transform, we can smooth this out and we get
Okay, thanks.
Do I have a? No, I should have shown. I have the bare data, but I didn't show it. No more question?
Maybe I have a question. So your calculation is essentially fermionic, yeah? You have this determinant. Can you do anything like this for bosons?
Yes. I have one postdoc who is actually implementing that. So bosons, it looks like it's more complicated because you have permanent. On the permanent, instead of determinant, it takes n³ operation to calculate a determinant. On the permanent, it takes 2 to the n operation. It's exponential. So it looks bad. But on the other hand, if you have a bosons and fermions, typical interaction term will be like C dagger C times B plus B dagger. So it will be quadratic in fermions and only linear in bosons, which means that whenever you're calculating at order 10, you are order 5 for the bosons, and at the end of the day, the complexity should be the same. So, so it's something that we are about to implement. I mean, we have done all the preliminary stuff, and we are implementing that as well. And yeah, and possibly we could also use fermions to do spins, for instance, using any fermionic representation of SU2 spins. So in principle, it's very general, but in practice, we have to, demonstrate that it works.
Okay, thanks. No more questions. Well, I guess then we can thank you again for your presentation. For
thank you.
So everybody, thank you everybody for questions, and so we are done.